Speaking as a huge Nintendo nut, I'll admit that Nintendo has never been perfect over the years. Not even during their years as a playing card company. But since I was never a fan of Nintendo's work prior to video games, let's take a look at 5 things that Nintendo had done, but could have done in a different way. Not that these would have made any significant difference, but I'm sure these would have made things more appealing to consumers. All these choices focus on Nintendo consoles from the NES/Famicom to the GameCube, as well as the handhelds released during those eras. Here are the 5 things I wish Nintendo did differently. We're all familiar with the Super Nintendo's Super Game Boy, the first public method of playing Game Boy games on TV, and they could be played in color. There were even games that took advantage of the Super Game Boy, especially Donkey Kong and Space Invaders. Then, in 1998, Nintendo came out with a second model, the Super Game Boy II. It had link cable support for trading Pokémon, a fixed clock speed, and new borders. But there's one problem. It was only released in Japan for the Super Famicom, not in the West, and not for the Nintendo 64. Nintendo of America was already focusing on the Nintendo 64, so releasing a new device for an already discontinued system wasn't such a good idea. But I think Nintendo should have made the Super Game Boy II for the Nintendo 64 instead of the Super Famicom, or still release the one for the Super Famicom, but also release one for the Nintendo 64. The Sony PlayStation was hawking most of the good role-playing games, so being able to play Pokémon on the Nintendo 64 would have been a great way to fill that gap before the release of the GameCube. I also wish they'd have added some support for Game Boy Color games, especially the exclusives, even if it meant delaying the initial release to later that year. True, the Game Boy player for the GameCube did make up for this issue, but it doesn't utilize the enhancements for the Super Game Boy Enhanced games, and the borders aren't quite the same. Oh, and did you know that the default border on the Super Game Boy II resembles a Game Boy Pocket? So, in conclusion, the Super Game Boy II would have had a better chance for a Western release had it been released for the Nintendo 64. Game Boy Color compatibility would have been a huge plus. The Nintendo 64 had a wonderful library of games. In fact, its quality totally outweighs the PlayStation's quantity. Now, unlike the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation, Nintendo stuck with cartridges for the new system. For some, it was a good move. It reduced manufacturing costs significantly, it kept the price of the system low, piracy at the time was heavily reduced, the cartridges were far more durable than CDs, and the loading times were practically non-existent. But for third-party developers and publishers, it was more about money. Cartridges would cost them $10 to $30 a piece compared to CDs, which would cost only 10% of the cost of a cartridge. This would result in ordering cartridges at a lower rate than CDs for fear of losing money, or just not developing or publishing games for the Nintendo 64 at all. Not to mention, early in the system's lifespan, N64 carts could only hold up to 16 megabytes, compared to a CD-ROM's 640 megs. With the system too far in development to switch to CDs, Nintendo came up with the only solution they could, the Nintendo 64 Disk Drive, or 64DD for short. The add-on's magnetic discs were rewritable, cheaper, and could hold up to 64 megabytes of storage. Plus, it could connect to the internet. Quite a number of titles were planned for the add-on, including a sequel to Super Mario 64. The 64DD was slated for a release in 1997, but pretty soon the device was delayed, constantly. By the time it was released in December of 1999, Sony had already announced the PlayStation 2, the Sega Dreamcast was already out worldwide, and Nintendo had already announced Project Dolphin, which would later become the GameCube. Plus, it was only available via mail order early on. and later received a limited retail release. And it was never released outside of Japan. Only 10 games were officially released for the system, such as the F-Zero X expansion kit and a series of Mario Artist art programs. What I think could have been done is that Nintendo would simply have released it as originally slated. Plus, I think they should have gotten started on developing hot new titles for the device after announcing it. I'm sure with a few compromises to the Final Fantasy games, Nintendo would have allowed Square to make games for it. Mario 64 2 surely would have been a major seller on the platform. I'm sure it also probably would have gotten a Western release. Again with the Nintendo 64. This time concerning the cartridge format. I'm certain the system being CD-based would have jeopardized profits, considering how badly the 3DO, the Neo Geo CD, and Sega Saturn turned out. All three of those consoles were either too expensive at retail or too expensive to manufacture, or both. Sony had very deep pockets. Nintendo, Sega, SNK, and the 3DO company didn't. But again, some developers wanted little or nothing to do with the system. Those that did, a number of them wouldn't cough up the cash for the cartridges, at least until 2000. LucasArts had developed the Star Wars games for the Nintendo 64, but what company was publishing them? Nintendo! It was a smart move. Since Nintendo owned the factory that manufactured cartridges for their consoles, they could easily save developers a ton of money. And it wasn't just the Nintendo 64. Nintendo had also published a few third-party titles for other consoles in North America, such as Capcom's Street Fighter Alpha 2 for the Super Nintendo, Taito's Space Invaders for the Game Boy, and Capcom's Mega Man 6 and Square's Rad Racer in the first Final Fantasy for the NES. Surely these developers would allow Nintendo to publish their games, right? It would have saved them a ton of money and they'd only have to pay a licensing fee. It's fair to wonder what would have become of the Nintendo 64 had Nintendo decided to publish a large number of third-party games. Three in a row, you might say? Yep, but this time it has to do with its best-selling title, Super Mario 64. The potential sequel for the 64DD was, in a way, already covered earlier. But now it's time I went over what I think should have been done about the original game in general. For starters, it's single player only. Adding multiplayer co-op would have been a huge plus for this 3D platformer. And it also would have been a golden opportunity to incorporate Luigi into the game. Yes folks, there was no Luigi in Super Mario 64. We got Mario, we got Toad, we got Princess Peach, we even got Yoshi, even though he only appears after you get every star in the game. But no sign of Luigi. According to Destructoid, Shigeru Miyamoto had originally intended for Super Mario 64 to include Luigi and multiplayer, but for whatever reason, his team couldn't pull it off. Still, it's fair to wonder if Miyamoto's team had been able to work around this issue. But if multiplayer wouldn't work anyway, why not implement Luigi into the game in another way? Like in a cameo, or as a damsel in distress before going after Peach. What's more, Luigi doesn't appear in Super Mario Sunshine either. It wasn't until Super Mario Galaxy that they finally put Luigi in a 3D Super Mario game. And in Super Mario 64 DS, we finally got our wish to have Luigi in Super Mario 64, about 8 years late. I only wish Nintendo had put Luigi in Mario 64 and Sunshine from the get-go. At long last, we take time off away from the Nintendo 64 and shift our focus on the GameCube. What should Nintendo have done for it? DVD playback? Of course not. It would have been too expensive to produce and probably would have sold for more than the Xbox and the PlayStation 2. Or if it had been sold at its launch price with DVD playback, Nintendo would have lost serious money. True, Panasonic did come out with a DVD player with a GameCube built in, but that was still pretty expensive, especially with standalone DVD players coming down in price. The mini DVD format was a great idea, but its biggest of few flaws was that it could only hold up to 1.4 gigabytes of storage. some developers tried to mitigate this issue by releasing multi-disc games like Namco's Tales of Symphonia and Capcom's Resident Evil games. However, there were dual-layered mini DVD discs that could hold up to 2.6 gigabytes, and I'm sure the GameCube could have benefited from it. The Xbox and PS2 used dual-layered DVD discs, so why not the GameCube? Expensive? Maybe. But then again, after Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Nintendo started using dual-layered discs for the Wii. Games on dual-layered mini DVD discs probably wouldn't have helped the GameCube to outsell the PS2, which was already well ahead with the out-of-the-box DVD playback and backwards compatibility. But it certainly would have helped to get ahead of the Xbox. To add to that, developers would have made a lot more games for the GameCube. Rockstar and Take-Two likely would have brought the GTA series to the GameCube, even if only one game. And that series was a huge seller on the Xbox and PS2. And Nintendo themselves could have made a lot of big-time games for their best franchises. At least Nintendo learned from this mistake. Thanks to Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Wii games were made on dual-layer discs to accommodate for larger games. But it's fair to wonder exactly what would have happened for the GameCube had Nintendo gone with dual-layer mini DVDs, as well as their original single-layer from the very beginning. So there you have it. 5 things I wish Nintendo had done differently, even though they did incorporate some of these ideas into future projects. I know these are a bit far-fetched, and there are quite a few other things I think Nintendo should have done during the pre-Wii era, but I'd like to know what you wish Nintendo had done differently in the comments below. Thanks again for watching Gaming Delight. Until next time, happy gaming!